Thanks for tuning in to another TellyCast. Before this week's show, I wanted to remind you to sign up for our free weekly newsletter, TellyCast Plus. It features interesting TV industry news stories from a different angle and exclusive content, such as Opinion and The Secret Producer, our anonymous TV exec reporting from the front line of TV production. Plus, we're bumping up the goodies with more free downloads of TV industry reports, discounts, and exclusive access to some live TellyCast events we're planning for the months ahead. And you'll only get access to those if you're on our mailing list. And don't worry, we don't like spam either, so we won't do anything weird with your data like sell it to advertisers or anything. Just sign up at our website by searching TellyCast on Google or visiting telecast-podcast.com. Thanks a lot.
TellyCast, the TV industry news review.
Has sports broadcasting changed forever over the pandemic? Will the English Premier League launch its own SVOD service? And following the Warner Media Discovery and Amazon and MGM Studios deals, who's next to get swallowed up in the streaming wars? Find out on this week's TellyCast. This week, I'm chatting with former head of programs and special projects at IMG and now consultant for the company, Charles Balchin. Plus, producer and adjunct professor of TV and media at NYU Stern School of Business, Evan Shapiro. So we've reached the 61st episode of TellyCast, and I realised that so far we haven't spoken to any senior executives from the most popular genre of content programming, and that's sports. Sports programming not only props up many cable and linear broadcast networks, but also points to the future with new and existing SVOD services getting in on the act. So to discuss this and more, I'm delighted to welcome former head of programs and special projects at IMG and now a consultant to the business and also running his own company, Charles Balchin. Welcome to TellyCast, Charles.
Thank you very much. Outrageous that you haven't had sport before. I'm shocked, outraged.
Well, absolutely. And it is interesting that sometimes we overlook sports programming and the enormous sort of technical feats that are going on every single day, but certainly every single weekend. And we don't seem to notice them as much. So I'm really glad that you're here to help me put that right. IMG is a behemoth in the world of sports production and actually TV and content production as a whole, and is easily the biggest producer of content in the UK. Can you start by giving us just a brief overview of the business?
Sure. Well, obviously sport, yes, but the wider picture through our American owners' endeavour, it does include entertainment, drama and film. Then there's models, IMG Academy, our sales arm, our sponsorship arm, and a very large events team. So, as you say, it's a bit of an amorphous animal. It's quite difficult even for those of us within the company to keep up with what's been bought in the last few weeks.
Yeah.
But it's very exciting. In terms of sports specifically, which is obviously my area, Premier League Productions is the 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week Premier League channel. You watch that anywhere else other than the UK. If you're watching Premier League football, you're watching it through that channel. 55 European Tour golf events. Right now, I'm looking after 240 volleyball games in Italy for the Volleyball Nations League, 240 basketball games, including the Final Four in Germany last weekend, which, by the way, was the first time ever for any team or ball sport to be streamed live on TikTok. And we cover every single EFL game from the Championship through to League Two remotely from our Stockley Park HQ. And those are just the ones I can think of off the top of my head.
On the sports side alone at IMG, how many people are employed and how many people are involved in the productions as well? I mean, it must be an enormous number of people.
It is, and it fluctuates. Clearly, if you came in during July, there wouldn't be as many as if you came in during February. I mean, the theory that we all sit and do very little in the summer is sadly totally not true. There's the small matter of Wimbledon, the small matter of the Open Golf, et cetera, et cetera. But clearly, when football is at its peak, that's when, you know, there are literally an extra 300 to 400 people in the building specifically for that sport.
So you've been with IMG for 12 years, and obviously you've seen an enormous number of developments within the business, but also, you know, technology-wise, and also buyers for sports content. And you're now a consultant to the business, and you recently launched your own business. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yes, small backroom productions. IMG is still the biggest client for me, by the way. And I'll be, you know, totally honest and say that it had just got to a stage where I wanted to get back a little bit more to making TV programs. And in my role at IMG, I was writing an awful lot of tenders and responding to those kind of things, and attending all sorts of courses that everyone felt I should attend, and they may well be right. But I suddenly thought, you know, it's actually been a while since I've been in a gallery. It's been a while since I've been in an OB truck. So it just came to an agreement with IMG where I would still do a lot of the things for them, but I would be free to do other things. For instance, I'll be at Silverstone for the Formula One Grand Prix. You know, that's my particular passion. I was producer of Grand Prix at the BBC for many years. So yeah, after that, it just allowing me to, you know, in the twilight of my career, to get back to having some fun and doing some things I've always wanted to do.
Most of what you do is presumably taking place on a weekend. How does that affect, you know, the way that you work 7 days a week? Do you see yourself working right the way through, or, you know, because there's presumably a lot of travel as well?
Before you hit the big red record button, we were talking about the fact that we didn't know this until a few minutes ago, that we're both Leeds fans. You said to me, was I at West Brom for the last game of the season when fans were allowed? And I said no, I only ever get to see Leeds if they're in London on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, which they quite often are, by the way. Games like Fulham and Brentford and QPR seem to be those games, because you've hit the nail on the head. Guess what? Saturday and Sunday are my busiest days. When I was a producer at the BBC, I was on an interview board for an assistant producer role that we had up, and this very nice chap came in, and about his third line was that he played five-a-side football on a Saturday, so would it be all right if he didn't work on a Saturday? So you'll not be surprised to hear that particular interview didn't last very long.
No.
I think the answer to your question is we have to have very, very, very understanding partners. Mine is an ex-BBC PA. I sat next to her while she counted backwards from 10, and I was directing the cameras, and so she completely understands.
Oh, right. Okay. It's like anybody. It's like people in the forces or in the police service. You know, you have to do it together to understand what it actually takes.
I think so.
To get the show out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, sports programming paused briefly, obviously, during the pandemic, and then restarted minus the spectators, which we've never really quite got used to, have we? To be honest, you know, it's different.
Despite the amazing efforts our audio colleagues make, by the way, but just, you know, the difference between going again to the Leeds West Brom game or any game you want to mention, actually having the crowd reacting rather than, you know, a very talented sound engineer just fading it up as the ball just brushed the post or whatever. Yeah, no, you're right. We never really got used to that, did we?
No. And we did see the odd time. I've seen the odd time when a ball kind of goes slight, you know, just very closely past the goal, and for a second there's a yes. goal celebration sound effect.
Yeah, and then someone's gone, oh no, it isn't.
Yeah, you can exactly. You can picture the fader being pulled down. But now looking at sports broadcasting and the pandemic, what do you think are the short and long term effects on the industry? The importance that government had all around the world to get sports going again, to keep people engaged, I think, can't be underestimated. But what do you think are the short and long-term effects of the pandemic on the sports industry and the sports production industry?
Well, first of all, it would be wrong of me not to doff my hat to our technical colleagues, because what I think some people forget was it wasn't weeks. In some cases, it was days before some sort of normality was back and some sort of programming was back. From the very, very high-level examples of UFC, where they all upped sticks and went to Abu Dhabi for a month and had fights there in a COVID bubble, to the more traditional sort of editors going home and getting something delivered by DHL so that they could carry on editing. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't doff my hat to those extraordinary technical people that achieved that. But in answer to your question, the change to different production methods has been well documented, hasn't it? The live remote production is now, it's happening now rather than something we thought might happen in a few years' time. Creating programs in the cloud is commonplace. Lots of us operate from our kitchen table. And like so many industries, COVID has been the catalyst to accelerate the future forward to right now. We've been forced to innovate with new techniques. And what I really like is that production and technical, who have sat opposite ends of the same table for so long, eyeing each other rather suspiciously, I think now have a totally newfound respect, which I think is absolutely great. And I think in the future, there'll be a hybrid of what we've learned about remote production alongside with the great advantages of actually being there. And I think that's what we'll see. I also think the rise of the athlete as the superstar, maybe even more than the sport itself, will definitely be something that will continue. Because in the absence of football, the fact that Ronaldo had a website where you could go and see him training in his backyard has had a massive impact. And now fans like that background stuff. They like that all access areas pass. And I think that will be something that will definitely continue.
That's interesting. So when it comes to footballers, let's say footballers, as their own brands, if you like, you see that is something that is only going to increase and get more powerful and perhaps manage more and more of their own image rights to different social media platforms, and that's just something that's going to increase, you think?
100%. The athlete as the star and as the driving force to viewers will just happen more and more. Yeah, absolutely.
Recently in the UK, we saw the Premier League roll over its current £4.5 billion broadcast agreement, essentially entering into a private sale agreement with current rights holders Sky, BT, Amazon, and the BBC, as opposed to the regular rights open tender process. Do you think that was fair?
I think under the circumstances, it was the right decision. Will the next auction be a watershed moment? We've asked that about each auction for the last 15 odd years. Do I think the bids will be lower? Probably not. Will they be substantially higher? Probably not. In the UK, a lot depends on BT Sport's long-term sports strategy, which at the moment is unclear. Internationally, I think what will decide the final figures is how the broadcasting world looks like at that time. Nothing clever or original in that. For instance, if Saudi Arabia is split away from the rest of the Middle East, and there is strong talk of a new sports channel in Saudi Arabia, then will beIN Sport bid the same amount without their most lucrative market? And will what the new Saudi sports channel, if it happens, pays be more than enough to make up for that? So, there's so many things that we don't know about in 3 years' time. And I apologize for having creosote on my bottom and sitting on the fence, but it's just the way of the world at the moment.
I mean, the other thing as well, which we've seen over the last few years, is Amazon dipping its toe into sports broadcasting. The one thing that we've seen, I mean, just in the last week, Amazon buying MGM Studios for $8 or $9 billion, is that, if Amazon wants to do something, it's got the money to do it. I think they've come in quite gently into the broadcast setup, I think. Do you think that's something that they're likely to increase their investment in sports, and particularly in football?
I can't see how that isn't going to be the case, because for me, the Warner Media Discovery joint venture that was announced a couple of days before the Amazon MGM one is just a further example of the consolidation that's going to take place. And I just think that if you're going to consolidate and therefore 15 players are going to become 5 or 6, sport, for the reasons we touched on at the beginning of this, has to be a part of that, unless you make the absolute clear decision that actually you're going to be the non-sports one, in which case fine, because we'll know, and we'll have plenty of friends that aren't into sport. But in general terms, I think once someone like Amazon and Facebook have made a foray into it, I can't see that they would now pull out of the tennis, which IMG do for them, or indeed for the Premier League rights that they've currently got.
We're going to come on to talk with Evan Shapiro in a little while on the show, and he's created something called the Media Universe, essentially, which is a map that he's created based upon all sorts of different data, which represents, how big the social media players are versus, a Viacom, for example, or and it's quite astonishing when you look at the size of these businesses like Apple and Amazon and some of the others. You mentioned Facebook and Google, their size compared to what we think are pretty big broadcasters. You look at it like that, you're thinking, well, this consolidation feels like it's speeding up now.
Absolutely. And listen, I don't want to take away from an expert in that field. I am but a humble sports jock. But what I would say is if Amazon can take just a few of the titles it now owns, such as Legally Blonde, Moonstruck, Poltergeist, Raging Bull, RoboCop, for instance, and turn them into multifaceted franchise media shows, those are TV, movies, podcasts, comics. Don't forget Amazon own Comicology, I believe, or whatever it's called. Then the increase of prime engagement, is extraordinary. The churn is lowered, and for a company worth more than, what are they, 1 trillion and growing? To me, that's a win-win situation.
It sounds like there are going to be some interesting moves ahead, and I'm sure Premier League rights and lots of other sports rights are going to be incorporated within that. When it comes to women's sport, we've seen women's football receiving its first significant broadcast deal fairly recently. Do you see women's sport in general to be a growth area for networks and streamers?
So the problem remains that most sports played by women are still not commercially viable. Also, we have to face the elephant in the room that many men still do not believe in the value of women's sport. If I put up a picture of, Emily Scarratt, who was named World Rugby Player of the Year in 2019, and then a picture of Owen Farrell, who captained England to the Six Nations in 2020, I would guess something like 85% would know one and not the other. So all of us in TV need to take responsibility to create heroes out of these amazing athletes, people who resonate with fans, who will drive the narrative onwards and upwards. Tennis is the only sport where women have anything close to the money, recognizability and sponsorship potential of the men. And actually, having said that, equestrian may be the only sport where a woman, Charlotte Dujardin, has a bigger profile than the men. Both those sports have one thing in common. They either compete with the men, equestrian, or their events are scheduled around the same time as the men, tennis. And I think that's the key, Justin.
Oh, interesting. Well, hopefully it is something that we, as viewers as well as industry executives, people can open their minds a little bit more because, just commercially, as well as it being the right thing to do, commercially, it's a massive opportunity, isn't it? I mean, you would think there's a huge audiences out there that are not engaging in sports that could do so.
Absolutely, and it's also massive for potential sponsors because it's reaching what I'm not an expert. What I'm led to believe is a traditionally difficult to reach audience.
Now, we've seen the streamers entering sports programming, as we've mentioned, and DAZN and Amazon with their football and tennis coverage. Do you think there are any benefits or new opportunities producing sports for SVODs from a production perspective? Are there things that you can do on an SVOD that you can't on linear channels? I mean, how does it work from a technical perspective?
Well, COVID again has hurried us along sort of, the path that streaming was heading down. The issue for me is quality v cost. If I can stream, I don't know, a national table tennis tournament on 3 cameras for £5,000, organisers can't understand why an event of international significance with, let's say, 9 cameras can cost £35,000. They can't understand the price differential. They go, well, 3 to 9 cameras surely is 3 times the cost. So 3 times 5,000 is 15. You're making a fortune out of us here. They don't understand graphics, uplinks, communications, replays, better lenses, etc. So I have a slight concern that the one is making the other a bit of a challenge. For Endeavour Streaming, another part of the company, they don't care. They just see they have more stuff that clients need putting out there. So there's a bit of a mismatch between the two parts of the company in those terms. But in general terms, I think you can try things more when you're streaming than when you're doing a more traditional terrestrial broadcast. And I think that's because if you've been asked to stream something, the people who are asking you to do that generally have a slightly more open view as to what they want to see.
Now, we talked a little bit earlier on in the show about technology and sports production. What do you think are the next big developments that we're going to see on screen when it comes to, let's talk, we've talked about football. Let's talk about football. What are the big developments that you think that are going to take the sport forward from a viewer's experience perspective?
Well, my engineering and technical colleagues will have a laugh at me answering this question, but I will have a go. In terms of sport generally, and certainly football, I think co-viewing, such as BT's Watch Together, is going to become very commonplace. And I think that is particularly when we weren't able to get to sports events as crowds, that's really taken on the experience to quite a high level. Clearly, direct to consumer is going to become even bigger. And in my world of sport, I'm watching DAZN very carefully. They're looking very aggressive, but can they make money? Amazon, we've talked about, they're not far behind with the tennis IMG make for them, the Premier League football they now show. The question is, are the smaller federations ready to do what the NBA and NFL have done in America? And my own experience right now with the FIVB on the Volleyball Nations League, says they are. So I think individual sports reaching individual smaller groups of fans will continue, and they won't be quite so desperate for BBC or Channel 4 or ITV to show things. The danger for that is they are only reaching the already committed rather than the potential viewer. Strange enough, I can actually see the rebirth of linear TV, because Netflix, I've noticed, is training linear TV in France.
Yeah.
And Amazon are hiring people with, quotes, skills in linear TV. So, I presume there has to be a reason for that. But for all live production, sport or not, I see a hybrid future of remote production with some elements of the traditional. IP might work in some places and not others. Satellite may still be the answer if fiber is not. What about 5G? Mainly, that's going to impact on the way we produce content and then distribute it. I know some local telcos will start connecting to local venues with 5G. I think Telefonica have already done that in Spain, I think. So I think 5G should change the broadcast operation from start to finish, with ultra low latency being a major plus point. And then finally, I guess, the cloud becoming more and more uncompressed will surely offer us up even more opportunities. In the meantime, we'll all be going to Amsterdam at the end of December to find out, what the latest technological toys are, and something will come out of there that will completely blow our mind.
Oh, that's at IBC.
Yeah, the IBC at the end of December. Yeah.
I've got to ask you, while I have you on the line, Charles, about the European Super League that we saw briefly, the shortest lived league competition ever, and funnily enough, I think I was chatting to somebody saying that actually Jose Mourinho was the shortest serving ever European Super League manager during that week or so that it existed. What was your view on that? Obviously, roundly condemned by everybody other than the 6 teams that were keen to be part of it, or the owners, should I say, that were keen to be part of it. I mean, what was your take on it?
First of all, an absolute classic example of how to not launch something. Do your research first, talk to people first, etc., etc. I think the fact that several of the driving force protagonists were American, where at the NFL you cannot get relegated, the NBA you cannot get relegated. I just don't think they had the slightest idea of the impact that sort of concept would have. And the fact that, was it the Man United fans or Man City fans? One of them, had a billboard that said, "I want my cold Tuesdays in Stoke." They knew that, there was a chance one day either Stoke City would come up or they would go down, and they would meet, and they wanted that. So I think, that really was the background to it. And all I would say is that I just think the great average fan felt that it was just something that they could never support. And I love the fact that so many of the big teams very quickly backed out. They saw what was coming and they backed out, and they apologized, and they'll get roundly fined, and life will go on. But it was just a badly thought out, badly executed plan.
So looking at the Premier League, the future of the Premier League, I mean, I've mentioned this a few times. I've had lots of chats with friends in the industry and just sports fans that are mates of mine, and never quite worked out why the Premier League hasn't started its own SVOD service. Why isn't there a Premier League Flix or Premflix or whatever you might want to call it? Some of the moves that it's been making in terms of the hires that it's been making would lead you to believe that is surely the right model for them, or the most profitable model. Can you ever see that happening? Premier League having its own SVOD service?
Bearing in mind that IMG does Premier League productions, and so I have to choose my words with some care here. Nevertheless, the fact that they do have Premier League productions means that they have the basis of what you've already described. So it wouldn't be beyond the wit of man for that to be developed into an SVOD service. My understanding is that they feel the way it is at the moment is better for them for all sorts of reasons. Should they get a whiff that Sky and BT got together at the back of Starbucks one year and said, "Tell you what, guys, let's really bid low because we know there's no one else." If they got a whiff of that, they would very quickly be able to change Premier League productions, which is an international broadcast element, to something that would work domestically. But I think they just feel, they would actually have to, I haven't done the maths, but, we all know the billions of pounds that have been spent. I think there'd have to be a very large amount of people paying quite a large amount of money to get to that stage. And then you've got to pay all your staff to do the channel, and you've got to have the facilities to do that SVOD, and you've got to pay someone to get the money, etc., etc. So I think it's there as a backstop, Justin, rather than something that we might see. But you know what? In 3 years' time, you might be ringing up and saying, "Well, you got that one wrong, Charles." But that's my gut feeling.
We've been talking a lot about football, obviously, but there are lots of new sports that have been developing. We looked at, been talking about esports before, and various other sort of these niche sports. What do you think the next breakout televised sport to hit the mainstream will be?
I guess that goes back to my point about direct to consumer. If you get that right, does it actually matter if a sport hits the mainstream? And you're right, neither of us are being hardly soothsayers when we say esports are clearly the next big thing. Maybe it already is a big thing. But for me, it's less about finding the new snooker, from 30 years ago, but more about which of the sports with strong female following and participation will grow. Women's football is already huge, but will cricket, rugby, and motorsport do the same? Will the W Series, which is a female-only single-seater motorsport series, engage the motorsport fan enough? We're all trying to go green, and sports like Formula E and the new Extreme E may appeal to what the Gen Z age group, as it's exciting and it cares for the planet. If I could tell you what the next mainstream sport would be, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now, but enjoying a yacht somewhere in the Bahamas. But I think female sport as a whole, if it's got right, is one area. Eco-friendly sports are something that I think people are sadly much younger age group than me, I think are very important. And so I think that's another area that will get quite a lot larger.
We've seen a lot of resistance by the public in Japan to the forthcoming Olympic Games. In your opinion, should they go ahead?
So again, the IOC are one of IMG's longest standing clients. Basically, what I would say is yes, if the COVID bubble protocols are rigorously enforced. I just this morning got my day 5 test to release, having been in Italy for the first week of the Volleyball Nations League, setting that up and making sure everything was tickety-boo. I woke up in the morning. I got into the coach that had been cleaned overnight. We drove to the arena. We were in a bubble where only IMG was part of. We did 12, 13, 14 hours worth of volleyball. We got back into the coach that had been cleaned again and went back to our hotel. And that happened every day. And for my colleagues who are there for another month, that will happen every day. On balance, I just think the Olympics is something that's so important to so many people that, yes, it is the right decision. But I totally understand while some people listening to this are shouting now and saying, no, it's completely the wrong decision. Surely being absolutely safe and looking after human welfare is the most important thing. It's a really tricky call. I'm just about on the side of yes, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, me too, actually. I think, we really missed the Olympics when they didn't happen last year. And, just the drama of it, even without fans. I think that all these athletes that have been working all their lives really for this moment as well. I mean, it's something that often brings the world together, I think, doesn't it? Every few years.
Correct. Correct.
So,
and you know what? You and I we'll be watching weightlifting with enthusiasm, which, for whatever reason, we don't for the other 3 years, normally 3 years, but we'll be watching weightlifting and we'll be marveling at the physique of the divers, and things like that. It just, if you're into sport, then I think it is the culmination. If you're not, I can well see why you're going, I cannot understand why there's even talk of this going ahead.
Well, I'm looking forward to that, and it's obviously a big year of sport as well with the Euros coming up, and obviously test matches, cricket test matches are just about to start. England, New Zealand's just about to kick off. So enormous amount of sport to enjoy. So, Charles, thank you for that. And now it's time for Charles to pick his story of the week, the TV industry news item that's caught his eye in the past 7 days. Charles, what's your story of the week?
Well, without a doubt, it's the merger, the buyout, Amazon buying MGM. Now, I'm aware someone more qualified than me is going to be talking about this. So maybe I'll just sort of touch on the things that I find fascinating. There's no question in my mind that what we're looking at is consolidation. Following, the Warner Media Discovery News getting together, we've now got MGM and Amazon. There is one key difference. Amazon's whole business is centered around Prime. They want you to buy stuff while staying on the site longer, because that way you might buy more. I guess while Prime itself drives annual revenue via subscription, I don't think that revenue on its own is enough. What they want and what they need is additional products being sold from Amazon and third-party sellers, so ratcheting up the additional revenue. I guess also the longer you're on there, the more time to advertise that dog hair comb you never wanted because, hey, you don't even have a dog. But, having a TV series that people want to watch and then using algorithms to push even more films or shows that might keep them on that site even longer is key, surely. And of course, sport is very much part of that mix. So, to me, it's a big story. I've touched on the fact that I think Amazon need to find a few titles and turn them into real franchises. And I think they'll do that. They might decide that Rocky needs a TV series. A lot of people are talking about Bond, but actually that's a bit of a red herring, because they aren't as free as they'd like to be on that, because the Broccoli family have still a lot of control. But to me, that's what it is. What does that mean for Disney, HBO, Hulu, and of course Netflix? I mean, together Warner Media and Discovery own over 25% of all new titles. And I think Netflix are only on 24. So, it's going to be some real challenges for Netflix, I think, who until now have been so dominant. I think they'll just find that there are some real competitors out there, and I'm sure they're going to react. But how they react will be really interesting. I guess, what's it all mean? Listen, I've got no clue. I'm just a sports producer, but if I were one of those smaller players, I'd be making myself look very attractive right now to potential buyers.
And now it's that time in the show where my guest gets to nominate their hero of the week and who or what they're telling to get in the bin. Charles, who's your hero of the week?
Justin, sadly, my heroes of the week are two great sports production personnel who passed away last week. And I just felt I wanted to take this opportunity to mention that. Thomas Bonacera was a great sports cameraman whose love of motorsports shone through, renowned for his work behind the camera, for his passion, his warmth, his artistry. Colleagues from the world of Formula One and MotoGP were stunned by this, as were many of us, and he'll be deeply missed. As will Steve Docherty, a great sports director who I've worked with for 35 years, be it badminton, snooker, cycling, athletics, rugby. Steve was a model professional who never accepted second best. That could make him a challenge sometimes, but he dragged everyone up to his level, and that level was as close to perfection as he could make it. So I just felt, to all in the industry who knew him, I offer my thoughts, but especially to those at V Squared TV, where he worked on the Tour de France for many years, and those at Sunset and Vine, where in recent years his rugby coverage has been outstanding. My own colleagues at IMG are also in mourning for our lead snooker director, and I don't think Sheffield will be quite the same again. But sorry to bring the level down a little bit, Justin, but I just felt I needed to take this opportunity to make those comments.
Absolutely. No, of course. And obviously, sadly, we saw during the months of COVID, we saw Murray Walker as well.
My great friend, Murray Walker. I was producer of Grand Prix at the BBC for many years. When I do get to write the book, the Murray Walker James Hunt chapter will be the one you all want to read, because honestly, we had a wonderful time, and two very disparate characters who grew to really, really respect each other.
Yeah, and who can forget Murray Walker's commentary when Damon Hill finally won the Grand Prix title and championship? It was absolute classic sports broadcasting.
Absolutely, and a great guy, and stood up for the whole 2 hours watching the race. on one occasion, in a very excited moment, someone went off in flames and James threw his hand up in excitement, knocking all Murray's notes flying. And I spent the next hour and a half scrabbling around trying to find the relevant one for whoever we were talking. Have you got the Alan Prost notes, Charles? Hang on, Murray. I'm just looking. So yes, it was. Absolutely, very, very sad loss.
Our thoughts go out to all the families of everybody who's passed away that you mentioned, Charles, and obviously wider as well. And who or what are you telling to get in the bin, Charles?
Justin, it's not a who, it's more a statistic that I'm saying needs to get in the bin. And it's quite interesting because that statistic has become very big news today. The day we are recording this podcast, that news has taken on new levels. So what I wanted to get in the bin was the fact that only 2 women feature in a recent top 100 earners in sport. And I felt that needed to get in the bin because it was outrageous. Both of whom were tennis players. One is Serena Williams. I think she was about number 44. But number 15, and again, the only 2 in the top 100, Justin, was Japan's Naomi Osaka. And, here is a world number 2 who's won her second US Open title, backed this up by winning this year's Australian Open, a 4-time major champion, and has acquired more than 50 million in endorsements. But now she's pulled out of the French Open. And the reason is she felt for her mental health, she didn't want to do any post-match interviews. She actually said answering questions after defeat amounted to kicking a person while they're down. So whilst that absolutely is not part of my get in the bin, and you could argue that she's a hero as well for making that stand, some people don't agree, but a lot of people do. But the main element I wanted to get in the bin was the fact that only 2 women out of 100 top earners in sport. And that's something we've touched on women a bit, Justin. That's something that I really think we need to change over the next 5 years.
As a guy, I feel really embarrassed.
It's embarrassed. You're absolutely right. And they're both tennis players. So that means no other sport has got its act together yet, in reality. So, So that's why I wanted to throw that particular stat in the bin.
Yeah, in the bin it goes. Charles, thank you so much for joining me this week. It's been fascinating chatting to you, and could chat much more about lots of the different aspects of the things that we've discussed, not least Leeds United, of course. But yeah. So I'll hopefully see you maybe at a match sometime, Charles. But until then, thanks a lot. Stay safe. Thank you again for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure.
Now, we've touched briefly on the massive media mergers that we've seen over the past couple of weeks, and just recently now with Charles, obviously. But here to discuss these in a bit more detail and to speculate on who's next on the block is Evan Shapiro, Emmy and Peabody award-winning producer and Adjunct Professor of TV and Media, NYU Stern School of Business. Welcome back to the show, Evan. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
It's great to see you. You're speaking from the roof of your apartment in New York City?
Yeah, it's my apartment building. Yep.
It's nice. It's the first al fresco TellyCast recording. So it's always good to have a first. And you're also the first person to come back on the show 3 times.
Hey, wow. What an honor.
So first of all, it's been media merger madness. So first of all, let's break down the Warner Media and Discovery deal. What do you think? Smart move?
I mean, there's smart and then there's kind of just inevitable, so yeah, I think smart in that from an AT&T standpoint, quite easily one of the greatest pieces of media malpractice in history. Scott Galloway actually put out an interesting chart this week based on his daily Benjamin burn metric, which is the number of dollars burned by a CEO per day during their tenure. And Randall Stephenson came in second only to Steve Ballmer. And the Steve Ballmer one was exacerbated by the Nokia purchase. This one, between DirecTV and Warner Media, Randall Stephenson at AT&T set on fire about $100 billion during his tenure. So this Warner sale is basically a white flag from AT&T saying we're out of the media business. This comes on the heels quickly of the DirecTV sale. So they bought DirecTV for $65 billion, sold it for $15 billion. They bought Warner Media for around $85 billion, although probably closer to $100 billion at the end of the day, and sold it for a value of $43 billion in this last thing. So, AT&T is basically, this is them leaving the media ship like the rat that they are. There was no way this wasn't going to happen. It was just a question of who was the partner going to be and when was it going to happen. Whether there was talks about them merging with NBC Universal and other things like that. In the case of Discovery, Zaslav, I think, rightfully knew that there was just no way for Discovery Scripps to fight in the media wars without a massive amount of scale, which they did not have. And so they were either going to be purchased, at which point Zaslav would be kind of the acquiree. And I think that was very much not a standpoint he wanted to have. So he decided to be aggressive, and he saw an opportunity because he knew AT&T wanted out of the game. And so this was a very smart move for Discovery. It should be noted as well that John Malone, who was the largest shareholder in Discovery prior to this move, he changed the status of his shares from an A-class preferred share to a regular shareholder during this move. And there's many reports, including his own statements, that demonstrate that this is not the last time that this combination will transact. That it's very likely that after this goes through, the Disco Warner, as I like to call it, will be sold again. So I think it was an inevitable move. Whether it turns out to be smart or not, I think is another thing altogether. The cultures of Discovery and Warner are very different. Discovery is a very unsiloed business, and Warner is traditionally one of the great silo makers of all time. Discovery is very much not a Hollywood machine, and Warner Media definitely is a Hollywood machine. But from the standpoint of a streaming service, I think the combination of Discovery Plus and HBO Max is a great one. HBO Max was already picking up a lot of steam this year. Discovery Plus launched pretty well, but the combination of these two, having Property Brothers and HGTV's library combined with the Warner library of the DC universe, HBO's universe, Adult Swim, CNN, I think is going to make probably one of the three best channels on earth in the Netflix, Disney Plus / Hulu, and now the HBO Max Disco world.
Essentially, it's a marriage of convenience, we think.
Absolutely, without question. And by the way, evidenced by the fact that nobody's valuation really skyrocketed afterwards. I mean, it's not the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of thing, because these two companies weren't really competing for the same consumer, which is what makes them such a good combination. The Discovery viewer and the HBO Max viewer were very unalike. They had different tastes, they had very different demos, different economic profile, different psychographic profile. So the combination of them of the two, kind of like conquers the family in a way that Netflix definitely does, and the continuum of Disney, ESPN Plus, and Hulu does, but really no other service on earth does at this point, except maybe Amazon does to a certain extent.
Officially, I mean, as far as I could work out the figures, it means that this new merged group is now a third, I believe, in terms of subscriptions, global subscriptions so far. So I think it's about 50 odd million.
Yeah, well, because you have to throw in all of the HBO subscribers, even the ones that aren't HBO Max, and so this puts them actually probably over 60 million combined. And remembering that the vast majority of those subscribers are in the US, so they have a tremendous amount of growth cycle ahead of them.
And obviously, not to be outdone, Amazon then bagged MGM Studios for about $8 billion. What did you make of this deal? Again,
I would use the word inevitable. MGM had to sell. They were designed to sell. Their investors were looking to sell. They bought the company to sell it. It was a house flipping exercise. And Epix is not really a channel that has any kind of brand awareness or real, leverage in the marketplace. So it's the library that has value here. it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the OG traditional media companies like the HBOs and the Disneys to buy a company like this, because none of the OG media players who have big libraries were going to pay, close to $9 billion for this company. It was going to be a tech company who needed a library play. So it was going to be either Apple or Amazon, potentially Alphabet, or a company like that. But really Amazon and Apple were the only two that made a whole lot of sense. And Amazon has demonstrated a desire and willingness to spend a gargantuan amount of money on franchises. So they put $500 million. Actually, they've put close to $1 trillion into the Lord of the Rings franchise that they're starting up. So they spent $250 million just buying the rights, and then another $500 million basically making and propping up, putting up the show. The IP library play was something obviously they were very, very interested in. And so this really falls into that strategy. It should be noted that Amazon spent basically less than a month's worth of revenue buying this company. So it really was not a major purchase for them. I think people are making a much larger deal of it than it actually even deserves to be in the continuum of things. But that said, I think they're going to do great things. I think they will at least attempt to do better and greater things with the Bond library than what has been done at MGM over years. Not that the Bond films haven't been good, especially the Daniel Craig era is probably my favorite era of James Bond. But they've never made a Q movie. They've never made a Moneypenny movie. They've never made, there are a lot of really great spin-offs in the Marvel Universe strategy that Bond deserves and has never gotten, because MGM is a very small and cheap, notoriously cheap company. Pink Panther deserves a comeback. That's a really great franchise that could really spin off a number of wonderful, and I don't mean the Steve Martin years, I mean the Peter Sellers years.
Well, that was going to be my next point, is that Steve Martin almost single-handedly killed the Pink Panther franchise. But you're right, it's got legs, hasn't it?
Yeah, totally. Then you throw in there the fact that they own the Fargo IP, which has been one of my favorite series of the last decade. They own The Handmaid's Tale, which is another really great franchise right now. They control the Get Shorty ecosystem. They control the Legally Blonde ecosystem. So there's RoboCop. There's a tremendous number of really great pieces of IPs. It's not even really about the library per se, because most of those films are tied up in rights deals with other players right now. It's much more about the future franchise. And if you look at what Disney has done with Marvel and Star Wars and the Muppets and Pixar, so that's all acquisitions. And now they are just engines of growth within the Disney universe. This is that type of move. I'm not a big Bezos fan because I think he's Lex Luthor, but I think it's a brilliant move, and I think it will work out incredibly well long-term for Amazon. What it means for MGM and the people who work there and the people at Epix is substantially less certain, but the investors made out like gangbusters. So this was a much bigger win-win than I think the Warner Disco move was.
Fascinating, as you say, in its own right. The opportunity for expansion of its IP is going to be a really interesting one to see. Maybe we'll see a Bond TV series, or maybe not. I don't know.
Well, I mean, in the way that WandaVision was a really unexpected turn for the Marvel universe. I don't know if you've watched it. It's terrific. Yeah. I think, a television series about Miss Moneypenny would be amazing.
Yeah.
A spy TV show in the Mad Men take. I mean, it's just genius. And that's my own idea. I'm sure they'll get pitched 1,000 others. Q, the guy who makes all the machinery in the basement, totally unexploited character.
Inspector Gadget, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, pretty much.
Interesting. Now, looking further afield, we also saw, it was much smaller deal and much less reported, but we saw in France, M6 and TF1 merging or announcing their intention to merge. Obviously, it's going to be down to regulators to, and quote, provide a French response to the challenges from global platforms. Isn't this a warning to these huge US streamers and technology companies that we're talking about, that they can't just expect to steamroller through Europe and the rest of the world and hoover up subscriptions and duke it out between each other. It might not be as simple as that, as decisions are made in American boardrooms a world away from these territories, which actually may say, you know what, there's maybe a bit too much American Netflix and a little bit, too much of Amazon Prime here. And do you think that's going to be an issue going forward for the streamers?
Look, international expansion is just not a one-to-one game, as Netflix is finding out. They're expanding pretty well around the world, but it's costly. They're not just moving into Europe and setting up shop and hoovering up subscribers like you talked about. They have to produce local content. England being kind of an exception, because a lot of the content that Netflix makes translates incredibly well, and in fact, they have a tremendous amount of English-made content. Same thing with HBO. But outside of English-speaking territories, it's a very expensive game. 1/3 of Disney's subscribers comes from Hotstar in India, and that has almost no likeness to Disney Plus in the United States. It's primarily driven by cricket. Yes, I think it should be a warning, but I think this was always going to be an expensive proposition for the big, what I call trillion-dollar Death Stars or American media moguls. You have to make local content. You cannot just expand into territories without making local content. And you can expect that the local broadcasters are going to fight back. And it is happening. If you look at the Netherlands or Australia or France or Spain or Italy, the local streamers do incredibly well, because they have relationships with content. But if you look at what Netflix is doing in Spain, they're moving in and doing deals with pretty much every top content creator in Spain right now. And there's two reasons for that. One, they want to conquer Spanish-speaking territories, but two, the Spanish stuff actually does incredibly well in the United States. Money Heist does really well, and the new series from those same creators is doing incredibly well. But there's also another larger danger, which is this subscription model that's working very well for streamers in the United States and in Western Europe will not work around the rest of the world. It will not work in India. It will not work in Africa, which are two of the fastest growing content markets out there. And by the way, where the two largest content creators on earth exist. Bollywood and Nollywood are the two fastest producers of content on earth. Neither of those territories really cater to prepaid subscriptions. Most of the content is advertising driven, free advertising driven services. So everything gets more complicated after you conquer America. Conquer America is not easy, but Disney did it in record speed. Netflix has obviously done it. HBO Max is well on their way. Amazon Prime is definitely there. Nobody else really yet. But as they turn to international, it's going to be much thornier, much more costly per customer acquisition than I think these services imagine.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see how things play out. And not only fascinating for these streamers that we've been discussing, these, as you say, trillion-dollar Death Stars, but looking at the rest of the content industry, and I'm sure you've been busy redrawing your multimedia map of the universe, which I'll put a link on, which is, it's a really great piece of work. It just keeps getting better, actually. That's the great thing about it. As the universe expands, so does the Evan Shapiro Media Universe document. When we're looking at that, it really does highlight, actually, how small some of the, what we see as media giants, or maybe we've come to assume are media giants, actually are absolutely nothing when it comes to being, dwarfed by these tech companies. So with that in mind, I saw your post a few days ago, Evan, and I thought it was fascinating, where you've basically put together some odds and probabilities for the next 10 major media wars moves. Let's go through those and hear your predictions for who's going to be buying. Let's start with Lionsgate. Who's going to buy Lionsgate, in your opinion?
That's a comparable company to MGM from a size standpoint, and they also own their own streaming service in the way Epix was at MGM. So Starz is a really decent channel, actually much bigger than Epix was. I think this is one where you could see Netflix. I don't think Netflix is a major acquirer in general, but the value of Lionsgate is not so substantial that they couldn't come up with the capital to buy it. And I think the library there, you're talking about over 11,000 titles. It's just a massive library. And it would really bolster Netflix's kind of stickiness. So I could see Netflix doing it, but I actually think it's more likely that Apple would at twice the valuation of $4 billion for Lionsgate, which is basically what happened with MGM. It was bought for twice what it was really the market value was. Apple has that much in Tim Cook's couch cushions. Their major issue with their television service right now is library. They have good programs. Ted Lasso's a great show. Dickinson's a great show. They have some good movies. They just don't have enough, and it's really hurting them. So I would say if I had to give a probability, it would be Apple, and I think that happens soon. I think that happens this year.
This year. Okay. You can come back for the fourth time, Evan, and we'll go through and we'll see how you did. We'll look back at the reality. Now, how about A&E?
Well, this is easy. I mean, this actually is probably the next move, especially given the combination of Discovery and Warner, which is a nonfiction shop combining with a fiction shop primarily. That's a gross overstatement because CNN is obviously a nonfiction shop and they have nonfiction programming. But for the most part, that combination makes sense because it's a scripted shop combining with an unscripted shop. Disney already owns 40% or 50% of A&E. For them, making this purchase, there is no other buyer and it's not hard. And A&E just made a deal to have their content distributed on Discovery. And I think that's not something that Disney's going to be too thrilled with long term. So I think that one happens, I would say by the end of first quarter next year. That's A&E, History, Lifetime, a majority stake in Vice. It's a really nice portfolio of content. It includes Storage Wars and American Pickers and, a ton of content, a biography library, which is vast. A lot of content.
Yeah. Scripted and unscripted, as you say.
Yeah.
Looking at Viacom CBS, a lot of people have been turning their eyes towards both Lionsgate and Viacom CBS and just thinking, well, maybe they look a lot smaller than they did a few weeks ago. What do you think is on the cards for Viacom CBS as regards the purchaser?
So Viacom CBS, it's about half the size of what Warner was valued at in that transaction. So that transaction valued Warner Media at $43 billion. Viacom's in the 20 to 30 billion range right now. Yeah, I go back to Apple. Apple really needs library. Viacom CBS has one of the great all-time television libraries out there, and then it also includes things like Star Trek and Mission Impossible and a whole bunch of other really great film and television franchises on top of that. So because Paramount is included in there, Paramount Plus has a tremendous start on the streaming wars because they were CBS Access for a number of years. I think it's a steal at $50 billion, and I think Apple is the primary buyer in that scenario. But this is where I start to veer out into where I think the next stage of the media wars is going to happen, which is Facebook and Google both are facing tremendous headwinds from a regulatory standpoint on their advertising business. And I think they're going to need to diversify those businesses by dint of the fact that they're going to be regulated out of their illegal duopoly. And so I think Alphabet is a really interesting potential suitor for Viacom CBS. You combine Paramount Plus with YouTube, and it's a really elegant solution for both companies. I think that the combination of the two would be pretty good. So I could actually see a bidding war over Viacom CBS between Apple and Alphabet, with maybe even Facebook getting into the game.
Okay, I've got two more for you, Evan. Roku. What about Roku?
So Roku is a great company, very well run. They control about 25% of all connected TV devices in the United States. They're incredibly powerful. They're currently at war with YouTube. And this comes on the heel after being at war with HBO Max and Peacock last year. And they are a major, major player. They are also notoriously frugal. They're currently worth somewhere between $40 and $50 billion. But Apple TVs, the device was not really very much of a success. And I think Apple regrets that. There's a really interesting plug and play model for Apple and Roku. And by the way, the key problem with Roku's business is they have almost no footprint outside the US. So that's where their expansions are going to come, and it's going to be very costly. And so I think, you need a deep pockets buyer in this case. I don't think Samsung will be allowed to buy them for regulatory reasons. So I think Apple is one, but here's another, again, next stage of the media wars. Microsoft really wants into the entertainment business very, very badly. They tried to buy TikTok last year, it failed. They tried to buy Pinterest, failed. They tried to buy Discord, failed. They have deep pockets. They've got money in their pockets, burning a hole in them. Sandela really wants to be in the living room game. And I think Microsoft is actually the most likely buyer of Roku for many, many different reasons. That's a next stage of the media wars game, which these trillion-dollar Death Stars really, and I think Amazon fired the starter's gun on it last week with the MGM purchase.
One last one for you. This is fascinating. So this is DAZN, which is obviously the Netflix for sports, is how it's been positioned. Starting to pick up some sports rights, some interesting sports rights around the world. What do you think?
I really think Disney would be the most likely buyer, but I just don't think from a regulatory standpoint they'll be allowed to because of ESPN. In these purchases, you have to factor in EU, Australia, and US regulators. They're going to play heavily in these moves. I would say Disney would be the natural buyer, but I just don't see it passing the regs right now, at least while Biden is in office in the US. Again, I go back to Apple. They want to be in the television business. Tim Cook has said they're in acquiring mode. Again, they could buy. DAZN is valued at around $4 billion right now. Apple has that much, in the till at the cafeteria in their headquarters. So I think they would be a good one, but I actually see Netflix is, again, I don't see them as a major acquirer of company, mostly because of their cash position is not terrific right now. But they're going to need new weapons to fight in the media wars. And I could see Netflix being one of those companies that gets in the game. But don't sleep on Amazon, who just took over Thursday Night Football, for $1 billion.
Fascinating. Well, sports is something we were speaking to Charles Balchin earlier on, and who's one of the world's biggest sports producers. And, we know how resilient sports is and how people have been, consuming sports. And Netflix, other than its sports factual documentaries, really hasn't been in the game, has it, when it comes to sports? So
and they have no live viewership strategy right now.
Yeah.
If Netflix is going to make a move in content, I think news and sports is where they're going to go. But just one last freebie for you. I think that's not something they're going to do while they're on their own. So I would also say one that's not on my list, but is definitely going to happen, I would say in the next 36 months, is after Netflix gets acquired, not when, but after Netflix gets acquired, I see them, making real moves into news and sports. And the acquirer of Netflix is, again, very likely going to be one of the $3 trillion Death Stars I mentioned earlier: Apple, Alphabet, or Microsoft.
Fascinating. Makes your head spin. The amount of money involved and the amount of content that we're talking about, and obviously the number of people it's going to affect. But thank you, Evan, for walking us through that. We'll put a link in the episode description so everybody could take a look at that post. Let Evan know what you think.
Totally.
And Evan, we look forward to you coming back on TellyCast, and who knows, there may be all these deals may go through in the next few months, and we'll be back on again, ruminating on who's buying who, which Death Star's going to buy which Death Star.
Right.
All right. Thank you, Evan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's about it for another week's show. As always, thanks for listening. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to TellyCast and share it with friends and colleagues. And a quick reminder to sign up for our free newsletter called TellyCast Plus. It's packed with interesting TV industry stories of the week you may have missed, downloadable reports and surveys, and exclusive insight and opinion, including The Secret Producer, our intrepid, anonymous real-life exec reporting from the front line of TV production. It's all completely free. Just visit our website to sign up at telecast-podcast.com. That's telecast-podcast.com. And you can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. TellyCast was edited by Ian Chambers and recorded in London. Until next Thursday, as always, stay safe. Thanks for listening to another TellyCast. A quick reminder to sign up for our free weekly newsletter, TellyCast Plus. It features interesting TV news stories from a different angle and exclusive content, such as Opinion and The Secret Producer, our anonymous TV exec reporting from the front line of TV production. Plus, we're bumping up the goodies with more free downloads of TV industry reports, discounts, and exclusive access to some live telecast events we're planning for the months ahead. And you'll only get access to those if you're on our mailing list. And don't worry, we don't like spam either, so we won't do anything weird with your data like sell it on to advertisers or anything. Just sign up at our website by searching TellyCast on Google or visiting telecast-podcast.com. Thanks a lot.